So now we will see a different application of random walks on graph. Till now we have been seeing how to rank nodes. So basically you hop from node to node and try to assign some weights to the nodes. We will look at a different, altogether different type of application. It's called clustering, which you are already aware of. Clustering of a graph is a very important problem. However, if you look at the literature, you will hardly find references to clustering using random walk. This is because those algorithms are not random walk per se. But when I tell you the algorithm, those are mainly message passing algorithms. But when I tell you the algorithms, you can clearly relate them to some of the random walk algorithms which you already know. So I will go through two such algorithms. The first one, it's called Chinese whispers algorithm. It was proposed by Chris Biermann in 2006 to cluster some of the graphs that we encounter in natural language processing or some of the linguistic graphs. But the algorithm is general and it works for any graph. So it is based on a game which is known as Chinese whispers. So have you heard of that game? So it's called Chinese whispers, but there is also an Indian version of that game. I don't know what the name is. What you do is, say suppose there are 10 friends. You sit in a circle and then one of the person who is the starting point comes up with some sentence, some interesting sentence, and whispers it into the ear of the next person. Next person can listen to it only once, and whatever he or she understands will whisper to the next person, and it will go in the chain and then come back to this person. And usually it will be completely garbled by the time it comes back. It will be a very funny new thing. So and then this person keeps on querying backward, what did you hear, what did you hear, what did you hear, and the point where he gets a mismatch, like the person heard the wrong thing, he is the loser, sort of. So you know, depending on the game, there is some punishment. Maybe sometime it might be that the person next to him starts the game next time, or sometime it might be that there is some small punishment and so on. So the idea of Chinese whispers algorithm is based on this particular game. Yes, so all these games, most of these games are trust based games, and there are always, you know, scope of fooling the other people. So as we and fortunately in this graph theoretic formulation of Chinese whispers, there is no scope of lying, because for the time being it's not a distributed algorithm. We will think that, you know, there is a single machine which is simulating Chinese whispers on this. So they are not allowed to lie in any case. So think of a graph. I am taking an example of a linguistic graph, language graph, because that's where Chinese whispers was initially applied. So this graph has nodes corresponding to the words like sky, color, blue and all, and the weights between the nodes suppose represent how similar are these two words in terms of the context in which they occur. So since sky, color and blood are nouns, they might occur in very similar context, whereas blue, light, red, these are adjectives, they will occur in some other kind of concept. So this is a particular example that I am taking. You can think of any graph actually, and these weights are kind of telling you how strong is the bond, how strong, how similar is the context. So basically you have an undirected weighted graph. You can also think of an extension of Chinese whispers on a directed weighted graph, but it has been proposed for an undirected weighted graph. So what happens, initially everybody, all the nodes are in different clusters. So that's what I represent here by the colors. So I will take a small example and walk it out, that will be easier. Suppose this is the weighted graph we are looking at. So initially all the nodes will have a unique ID. So there are 6 nodes, so there will be 6 clusters, and everybody is in his or her own cluster. So let's call them So, that is time step 0. So, what happens in time step 1? Everybody will send the information of its own class, which cluster it belongs to its neighbors. So, what happens is 2 receives from 1 that it is in cluster 1, and it receives from 3 receives from 1 that it is in cluster 1, 2 receives from 3 that it is in cluster 3, and so on. So, it happens through all the edges. Actually 1 receives from 3 that it is in cluster 3, and so on. Now, when you look at one particular node, so in the same step, what it does is it collates the information from all of its neighbors. So, what happens for 2? It receives 2 information. From 1, it receives the information that I am in cluster 1, this is one message, and from 3 it receives the information that I am in cluster 3. And then there is a weight. So, with this edge is the weight associated is 4, and with this edge the weight associated is 3. What 2 does? It takes a majority. So, what it does is, so 2 has 3 choices now. 2 could be in its own cluster level 2, it could maintain its own cluster level 2, or it could choose the cluster level 1 which it has recently received, or it could choose the cluster level 3. Now, let us assume for the time being that all the nodes chooses to be in its own cluster with weight 1, which would be equivalent of saying there are self loops with weight 1. Okay. So, what happens now is that suddenly 2 kind of receives, so the label of the 2 changes to, so let me redraw the graph. So, what happens for 2? The fact that its label is 2 gets weight 1. The fact that its label is 1 gets, it's weighted by the edges, gets weight 4. So, because this message came through this particular edge, so its weight is 4 depending on the edge strength, and the fact that it is it can choose also 3 comes with weight 3. So, which one is the highest? It's 4. So, it chooses the majority of them. So, its label now becomes 1. What about 1? Its label becomes 2. What about what about 3? Its labels becomes 2, because it receives actually 4, 2, 2, 4, 1 and 2, but the highest is 3. So, okay. What about this particular node? 5. What about this particular node? This? There is a tie here. So, when there is a tie, you could arbitrarily break the ties. So, in this case the tie is broken, say in favor of 4 or whatever, and that is the revised graph. So, this is one step of Chinese whisper. Oh, that is the graph given to B. So, in this case of it is from domain knowledge. So, you have a network, right, and you have constructed the network from the data. The data will tell you what the weights are. So, in this case, as I said, it is a similarity, how similar the context is between 2 words. So, if it is like I take a large language corpus and then find out the context in which sky occur, find out the contexts in which blood occur, and compute how similar they are. And this is an elaborate process, but to the input to the Chinese whispers algorithm is just only a graph, weighted graph. It does not consider how to get those weights and so on. So, this is after step 1, okay. And then you continue this iteration. So, what happens in step 2? Tell me. So, this is 3, 5 to 1. What happens to this particular node? It becomes 1. And what happens to this particular node? Becomes 2. What happens to this particular node? 1. And here? something like this. So, and it will continue to be like this, right. If you do one more iteration, you know, 1 will become 2, 1 and 2 will shift and 4 and 5 will flip. But if you look at it, 1 and this is like sort of one community. If you can look at the graph, you can easily see that this is one community and this is one community. So, the stability condition here unfortunately is not that all nodes are getting the same level. There is 1 or 2 levels in which it is changing. So, this is a very small graph. If you take a large graph with a large number of connections, a real world network, and then you do Chinese whispers, what will happen is most of the nodes will converge to some level and their levels will not change. I am not saying that all the nodes will converge. Many nodes will still change level from 1 to 2, 2 to 1 and so on. So, what you can further do is damping. So, what you do in the first round, the self weights, the loops have weight 1 as I said. So, you are giving very low priority to the weights themselves. So, people are encouraged to choose other people's labels. Maybe in the second iteration, you give them less freedom to choose other people, change labels and so on. So, if you do that, slowly the probability of changing labels will become so less that it will converge. So, it is a forced convergence sort of, you can see. No, not at all. We just see this one particular example graph where convergence is not guaranteed, is not possible. You could think of a line graph, you know, their convergence is never possible because there is no clustered structure at all. But if your graph has very good, you know, clustered structure, say the graph has natural clusters in it, then it can be shown that Chinese whispers, empirically it can be shown that the Chinese whispers converge very fast, and it converges in say for in order log n. So, all these are empirical observations. These are not like you can't prove it, maybe you can prove it, nobody has tried proving it. So, this is a very simple algorithm which kind of looks like a random walk, in the sense you can think of each node has started with a random walker and then the random walker goes to all the other nodes spreading its own message. So, one initiates a random walker saying I am 1, and everywhere it goes it says it is like campaigning, become 1, you should vote for 1 and so on. So, these random walkers go around and every time step, and they try to kind of persuade the other people to come into its community. And after, you know, usually say for a 10,000 word graph, it was observed that in 6 iterations it converges. But there are some nodes which will always oscillate. Typically nodes which belong to multiple communities, they keep on oscillating. So, and there are a few more technical details which I am not going into. So, this is one algorithm. So, here I just gave some examples. So, it might happen like this in the next step and further steps and so on. So, let me just tell you a couple of interesting properties about this algorithm, means why we would like to use this algorithm, and then we will move to the next one. So, first thing is this algorithm requires no parameters. So, other clustering algorithms say if you have you know k-means algorithm, then in k-means algorithm you have to give a k is a parameter. So, you have to know a priori the number of clusters. Then if you are talking of Redici algorithm, then you need to know the you need to specify the threshold and so on. So, for most of the clustering algorithms there is some threshold, some parameters based on which the number of clusters emerge. So, sometime you say give directly what should be the number of clusters, sometime by the threshold you control that. This algorithm has no parameters. So, how many clusters will emerge, that totally depends on the structure of the graph. So, that is the second good thing about this algorithm. So, it is parameterless and the number of clusters is a property of the graph and not of the not of any other parameter. And the question that does it converge for all graphs? Clearly no, but for most real world graphs it works really fine and it converges very fast. So, this is one algorithm which actually we also have used for some of clustering some other networks, and what we get is really good results. What happens is, since the number of clusters you do not kind of enforce, so you for the good clusters you get large sized nice clusters. But then you will have some small nodes, small clusters of 1 or 2 nodes which are like scattered. So the total number of clusters the algorithm will give you is maybe 500, 600, but the good sized cluster will be say only 20 or 30 depending on the graph. So you might ignore those unclustered nodes.
Could we just have some heuristic based on the weight of the nodes, because it seems that the highest weighted nodes are the ones where the flipping occurs.
Yeah. So those flipping is because I didn't present the algorithm, all the technical details of the algorithm. As I said, it's because you are just doing a majority weighting without considering anything. If you consider damping and if you normalize the weights, those flippings will kind of be taken care of.
So it finally we can get to know that 1 and 2 are
Yeah, yeah. So there are two things that can be done. One is by damping and normalization, those flippings can be taken care of. And the other thing is, perhaps which you are also suggesting, if you see a continuous oscillation, then stop and put them in the same category or something like that. Yeah, that also can be done. But usually continuous oscillations are seen between in nodes which belong to 2 or more clusters. So what this algorithm does is, say in the case of the previous network, words can be both nouns and verbs or nouns and adjectives. So they will flip between the cluster of noun and adjective and so on. So in those cases, what you can't say that this is a noun or this is an adjective. So what you do is this, you say that this particular word belongs to both the clusters.
As a developer, then is it a possibility that they will flip in a cycle?
All these possibilities are there. So as I said, nobody has really analyzed this algorithm. It can flip in a cycle and the length of the cycle can be 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. But for practical purposes, it works fine. So this is a recent algorithm, right? It was proposed in 2006. So it's yet to be analyzed. So you can, if you want, you can take it up and rigorously analyze for different kinds of graphs, how it converges and so on.
Sir, what is the motivation behind choosing the maximum weightage?
So it's unfortunately the example I gave there, the maximum weightage always dominated, but it need not be the case. Think of a graph like this. So suppose in one particular stage, this is the node x whose label you are trying to decide. So you have two nodes connected to it and both of them has already got label 1 and they have weights 2 and 2, and another node 2 which has got weight 3. Under such circumstances, actually what you do, when you get the same label from more than one of your neighbors, you add the edge weights to get the revised weight. So in this case, the label will be 1 and not 3, because 2 plus 2 is 4 and sorry, not 2, because this particular node has only weight 3, this particular label has only weight 3. So it's a sum. So you do the sum of each of the labels that you get, sum of the weights, and then you do a majority voting. And also another interesting question is, what is the basis of this clustering? So every clustering is based on some underlying assumptions or mathematical properties of the system. So again, this is an open question. As I said, no, but most probably it is related to the spectrum of the graph, because the technique is based on random walk. It sorts of simulates some kind of random walk, and random walk based techniques are usually explained by the spectral properties. It has a close link with the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of the graph. So we look at another algorithm. It's called the affinity propagation algorithm. It's also in same lines, in very similar lines. The only difference is this. So if Chinese whispers is page rank, then affinity propagation is hits. That's the analogy you could draw. Here, instead of kind of passing just one message, you pass two messages. Let's see. Before that, this was proposed by Frey and Dweck even after Chinese whisper in 2007, and it got very popular. It was published in Science. So here there are two kinds of messages that nodes kind of exchange. One is called responsibilities and one is called availabilities. So, responsibility message is a node might ask another node, are you going to take my responsibility? I want to join your cluster, are you going to take my responsibility? So, it's more like I am giving, I want you to take my responsibility with X, strength. So, that X is the responsibility message. And availabilities is a node might tell its neighbors, I am available to be your what is called exemplar. So, you could join my group and I am available with this much kind of strength. So, that is the basic idea, and the nodes pass those messages. So, again here the inputs are endpoints which are nodes in the graph, and you have a similarity matrix, that is the adjacency matrix you could say. So, Sik, every entry in the matrix represent how suitable an exemplar K is for I. So, do you know what is an exemplar? So, in this particular case, when you do a clustering, you say in Chinese Whisper, you get a cluster of nodes, and how do you know it is a cluster? Because all of them get the same label. So, you know that all nodes labeled 2 are in the same cluster and labeled 1 are in the same cluster, and so on. But how do you represent that cluster? Is there a representative member of that cluster? If there is, then that particular representative member is called the exemplar. So, what happens in the k-means algorithm is the mean or the median. So, you could choose the mean node or median node. In case of nodes, it is difficult to understand what is mean and median. You could think of points in Euclidean space and you are trying to cluster them. So, in that case, mean and median makes perfect sense. So, you could choose those as your exemplars. So, here the similarity matrix or the adjacency matrix tells us, so the weight between I and k tells us that how suitable k is as an exemplar to I. So, you could just assume it to be the weight between I and k in a weighted graph. It is nothing more, nothing less. And SKK, the self loop, tells you how likely it is for k to be its own exemplar. So, if SKK is very high, k can be an exemplar of itself, otherwise if it is very low, we do not want it to be an exemplar. So, in k-means algorithm, remember you give the k-means or you give k and randomly choose the means and so on. So, in this particular case, you say that there is a high chance of these nodes being exemplars. So, that is how you encode the high chance of something being an exemplar in the matrix. So, that is the input, and you have two types of messages. One is the responsibility. So, a node R sends a node I sends a message to a node K. So, I will use K always for exemplar and I for the non-exemplar. This is just the convention I am following. So, I will send a message to K that I want you to be my exemplar with this much of strength. That strength is what is called the responsibility, and it is represented in this case as Rik. So, in other words, it means I can choose exemplar any of its neighbor as its exemplar, isn't it? I can choose any of its neighbors as its own exemplar, but it will weigh a particular neighbor's odds against being exemplar against other neighbors. So, if I has say 10 neighbors, it will check compared to 9 neighbors how good is k being my exemplar, and we will see what is the precise formula for calculating this and tell this to I. The reverse is true for availability. So, k will send a message to I saying whether I am available or not, and with how much strength I am available to you to be your exemplar, and then this k decides based on if a lot of nodes are telling k that I want you to be my exemplar, then k should think that then it means I should really be the exemplar, and then it will say I that okay, I am available. And if most of the people say I do not want you to take my responsibility, then k will think okay, maybe I am not a very good node to be an exemplar, and it will say that to I that you see most of the people do not like me, why do not you choose somebody else. So, this is a bidding process kind of, and it goes on iteratively. So, pictorially it is something like this. So, there is this data point I, it knows how much this guy is available as an exemplar, this guy is available as an exemplar, and based on all its computation, all its possible options, it tries to estimate should I join to this guy or not. Of course, all this computation depend on the similarity matrix, original similarity matrix as well, and it sends that response. The reverse is true. So, when kind of k considers sending its availability to I, it says how much, as I said, how much responsibility other nodes are banking on me. If lots of nodes are banking on me, then I will say, okay, it seems I am a responsible guy, you can also bank on me. Otherwise, it will say, no, no, don't bank on me. So, based on what other guys say, it will respond. So, the precise formulas are like this. I do not want to get into the details of this. So, you just go through them. It's easy to understand, nothing very hard. So, responsibilities are similarity, that is the weight between I and k. Of course, that has to play a role, right, that how suitable k is an exemplar for I. So, that has to play a role, but you subtract it from max of other nodes. So, if I has 10 neighbors, you compute how suitable is the node 1, how suitable is node 2, and how suitable is node 10, and you choose the most suitable node among those 9 nodes and subtract that particular value from the suitability of k and send that. So, it can be negative as well. So, you get that you compute who is best at this point, who is best chosen as your exemplar, and you subtract that from the similarity and send it to I, send it to k. The availability is slightly more complex, but the values are chosen such that it's, you know, it's never more than 0. So, availabilities are always negative. It's a minimum of 0 and some other term, and this is a special case. So, what happens is initialization, you always initialize all the availabilities as 0, and responsibilities are of course initialized as, you know, you compute the responsibilities based on the availability initializations and recompute availabilities and so on. And at any point of time, you can stop the algorithm, and what you do at that point of time, you do the sum. So, for a node I, you calculate for all its neighbors, or say for all the nodes in the network, you calculate this term. What's the availability of a particular node for me, and how much responsibility I, you know, bank on, I give to that particular node, and the sum of that will, the max of that, the k for which this particular term is maximum, is assigned as the node which is its own exemplar. So, at any point you can assign all the exemplars and finish the clustering. So, if two nodes have the same exemplar, essentially they are in the same cluster, and now if the exemplar itself has another node as an exemplar, then all of them gets into the same cluster, all 4 of them. So, in this way you can compute the clusters. So, initially if you, I will just do a small simulation for you and show. So, if you start with a graph, initially actually the picture is not very clear. So, these arrows show who has suppose you stop at step 1 and see who is whose exemplar. You see there is not very clear, you know, exemplars that are emerging in this system. So, what happens is this guy says this is a possible exemplar, but this guy itself says this might be my exemplar, and this guy says this might be my exemplar, and so on. So, it is not that something very precise is emerging in this system. Some cases are clear, like in this case, but not always. As you go on in successive iterations, the picture gets more clear, it gets more coherent. So, you see here there is a node, and most of the nodes think around it that it could be a good exemplar. So, the node also tends to believe that okay, I can be a good exemplar, and it assigns maybe its own exemplar as itself. And if you go on, finally you emerge with, you know, very precise clusters where, you know, the node itself as well as its neighbors choose it as an exemplar. So, again there is no proof for convergence or anything for this algorithm. It was proposed, as I said, in 2007 and has been applied on a large number of real world networks, and people saw that for all those networks it really worked in an excellent way. So, this algorithm has 2 good things. First, here also you do not need to specify the number of clusters like in Chinese whispers, and the second, in Chinese whispers you do not get the exemplars, you just only get the clusters. Here along with the clusters you also get the exemplars. So, sometime you need the exemplars. Say I will give you one example. Suppose I take 100 pictures of all of you. say in different moods, different lighting and all, and I mix all those pictures. So, there are 40 of you, so there will be 4000 pictures. I mix all of them and give to this system. There is a image processing system which will try to calculate the similarity between any two pictures, and it will construct the graph, the similarity graph S, and then I give it to the affinity propagation algorithm, and it will do this iterative process. So, what at the end ideally we would assume is that say 10 pictures. So, it will come up with 40 clusters, and each cluster will have one example picture. So, which is like the picture of you which maybe is most noise free and the most without emotion and so on. So, some picture which you can show somebody, you can put it in your passport and so on. So, if you have some noisy pictures at 10 different angles and all, it might choose the one which is the most representative of your face. So, you can see exactly the same example has been worked out in the paper also.
Here also the exemplar will be the one which was most connected.
Yeah. So, exemplar is the one which is all these interpretations are okay, means you could get a hunch or a feel of the algorithm by thinking it in that way, but since it is really complicated, it is a iterative process, you really can't guarantee that will be the case. Most probably it is the case. Okay. So, that much that is all about Chinese whispers. We end it here. Yeah, I do not think